God and Science by John W. Dawley. Copyrighted by the John W. Dawley Trust. Narrated by Michael Drew. Chapter 7. Noah. The story of the flood, a historical improbability. Everyone is familiar with the story of Noah and his ark, but there can be few who believe in the flood as an actual world event. Considered literally, the story is fantastic, and no intelligent schoolboy would take it seriously for one moment. But considered as a mythical tale symbolizing an experience which comes to every man and woman, and illustrating that the understanding of spiritual fact is able to separate between the false and the true, the unreal and the real, the material and the spiritual, it is one of the most beautiful and inspiring symbols in the whole Bible. As history, the Bible commentaries do not credit it. Peake's commentary writes of the story of the flood. The question as to the historical character of the narrative still remains. The terms seem to require a universal deluge, for all flesh on earth was destroyed. Genesis 6:17, Genesis 7:4, and Genesis 21 through 23. And all the high mountains that were under the whole heaven were covered. Genesis 7:19. But this would involve a depth of water all over the world not far short of 30,000 feet, and that sufficient water was available at the time is most improbable. The ark could not have contained more than a very small proportion of the animal life on the globe, to say nothing of the food needed for them, nor could 8 people have attended to their wants, nor, apart from a constant miracle, could the very different conditions they required in order to live at all have been supplied. Nor, without such a miracle, could they have come from lands so remote. Moreover, the present distribution of animals would, on this view, be unaccountable. If all the species were present at a single centre at a time, so comparatively near as less than 5,000 years ago, we should have expected far greater uniformity between different parts of the world than now exists. The difficulty of coming applies equally to return. Nor if the human race took a new beginning from 3 brothers and their 3 wives, Genesis 7:13 and 9:19, could we account for the origin, within the very brief period, which is all that our knowledge of antiquity permits, of so many different races, for the development of languages with a long history behind them, or for the founding of states and rise of advanced civilizations. And this quite understates the difficulty, for archaeology shows a continuous development of such civilizations from a time far earlier than the earliest to which the flood can be assigned. A partial deluge is not consistent with the biblical representation, and an inundation which took 73 days to sink, from the day when the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat till the tops of the mountains became visible, Genesis 8:4, implies a depth of water which would involve a universal deluge. The story, therefore, cannot be accepted as historical, but it may, and probably does, rest on the recollection of an actual deluge, perhaps produced by a combination of the inundation normally caused by the overflow of the Tigris and the Euphrates, with earthquake and flooding from the Persian Gulf. There have been many deluge narratives, and it is believed that the Bible story is based on a Babylonian version. But, as we have seen, the prophetic writers used familiar narratives to illustrate for all time both the facts of reality and the falsities of unreality, that is, materiality. It is more and more evident that although these writers felt the necessity of showing the close association of the development of the spiritual idea with the development of the Hebrew nation, they cared little for the historical record as such, whilst the exact expression of spiritual fact was all important to them. Just as these writers had rewritten the old Chaldean record of 7 days of creation to illustrate how the divine order of revelation comes to men, just as they had then used the Adam myth to illustrate the operation of the first day of enlightened thought to expose a false, anthropomorphic sense of God and a false sense of man, just so they now used the story of Noah and his ark to illustrate the availability of spiritual understanding to separate the eternal facts of divine reality from the floods of mortal theories. Thus they symbolized perfectly, in the record of the second 1,000 years of Bible history, the operation of the second day of creation to establish a firmament in the midst of the waters. By this time it must be clear to the reader that in the consideration of the Bible record, as based on an ordered system of symbols, the first essential is to understand the real meaning of the root notions of this system. The days of creation revealing numerals of spiritual thought and idea. For this purpose, the reader will find constant reference to Appendix 1 helpful. The spiritual significance of Noah. The story of Noah, therefore, relates not so much to history as to the eternal now of science and reality. As a historical myth, the story of Noah would be of very little value in the spiritual enlightenment of the ordinary individual. As the symbol of a state of thought which understands and can prove the nature of true spiritual substance and all that this term implies, see Appendix 1, Second Day, it brings to light the value of the Noah in each one of us, our individual understanding and use in our lives of true purity, order, development, and so on, and our recognition of their potency to deliver at all times and under all circumstances from the floods of impurity, adulteration, stagnation, confusion, misunderstanding, reaction, failure, spiritual poverty, mental blindness, and so forth. Noah's Ark was really his understanding of God and of spiritual fact, which saved him from the turbulent theories of materiality. This spiritual vision is the only ark that any of us will ever be able to enter for our salvation from the floods of materialism. In the biblical story, there is nothing vague about the symbol of the ark. Its details are given very definitely. In this story, there is the most intelligent and inspired introduction of exact mathematical symbol into the myth that was well known to the people of that time, because its specific purpose was to illustrate the practical understanding and use of definite ideas of God forever operating in a divine calculus. Let us then consider in detail this colourful symbol of the flood, which begins in Genesis at chapter 5, verse 26. The word Noah means rest or comfort. It is made clear at once that Noah was so named because he was to be a comforter, and this is exactly what the developing understanding of God and man always is, to each one of us, a comforter. It is recorded that Noah's father, Lamech, lived 777 years, Genesis 5:31. This number may not seem to be very important, but remembering the deep significance to the Hebrew of the number 7, it would seem to imply that the Noah state of thought is the outcome of that stage of spiritual enlightenment, represented by the number 7. The constant recurrence of these so-called holy numbers throughout the Scriptures, and their literal inaccuracy in so many instances, leaves no doubt as to the fact that they were used symbolically. Here, then, it is evident that the Noah state of thought is the product of some spiritual understanding of the 7 days of creation and their application to the human problem. Indeed, whenever the Noah state of enlightenment is born to you or to me, it is the result of some understanding of those days of creation, which the prophets symbolized by "let there be light," and so on. In fact, the Noah symbol in the second 1,000 years of Bible history follows the Adam symbol in the first 1,000 years, just as logically and irresistibly as the number 2 follows the number 1 in the counting order of arithmetic. Noah's 3 sons. Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Is the fact that there were 3 just a coincidence? We've seen that Adam's 3 sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth, were symbols of the ordered processes of analyzing, exposing, and annihilating a material sense of things. They illustrated 3 stages of thought: the physical, the moral, and the spiritual. In the story of Noah and the Ark, these same processes are introduced on a higher scale through the symbols Ham, Shem, and Japheth to illustrate the mental and spiritual method through which Noah dealt with the flood of human theories. The development of this story would indicate that Ham represented the physical, Shem the moral, and Japheth the spiritual. The order in which the names are stated throughout this story, however, is Shem, Ham, and Japheth, except at the end of the record when Noah had lost his vision and was reaping the bitter fruits of his failure. Then the order of statement became Ham, the physical, Shem, the moral, and Japheth. See Genesis 9:24-27. The scriptural writers frequently change the order of their presentation to suit their purposes. For instance, the name of the sons of Jacob, or the tribes of Israel, are mentioned many times, but in very few cases in the same order. Yet a close study will indicate that in every instance the writer had a purpose for the particular order. It is related that Noah himself was 500 years old when he begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It may be asked which of them was born when Noah was 500. Certainly if Mrs. Noah had had triplets, it would have been expressly stated. For when Rebekah had Jacob and Esau, it was recorded that they were twins. Surely the statement of Noah's age as 500, therefore, must be another mathematical symbol of importance. It must indicate that his vision, which was born of sevenfold or perfect conception, was now attaining to some appreciation of the fifth day of creation, that is, to a sense of multiplication and of exalted thought, whereby he could begin to analyze, uncover, and annihilate the beliefs of material existence. As we have seen, the number 10 and its multiples, derived as a symbol from the 10 fingers, always symbolized the application of spiritual fact to the human. In Genesis 6:9, we read that Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Did this mean that Noah understood something of the only real process of generation or revelation, the 7 days of creation, indicating perfect divine order? If you and I understand spiritually and scientifically these days of creation or revelation, which have been called the seed plot of the whole Bible, we shall be perfect in our generations, and we shall walk with God, understand and demonstrate pure spiritual values, and thus be able to overcome the floods of mortality. Noah builds an ark. It is now related that God confided to Noah that the earth and all that was in it was corrupt, and that he must prepare an ark for his own salvation and for the salvation of his whole household. The Scripture states that God is of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on iniquity. Therefore this command, introduced by the familiar biblical formula, "and God said," must really mean that Noah's advancing spiritual sense discerned that the belief in material existence is just a temporal falsity which is doomed to pass away, and that he must put his every effort into understanding spiritual reality if he was to preserve himself and all that he valued from the flood of materiality. So it is recorded that he built an ark. The description of the ark in all its details is most illuminating. It must contain rooms, that is, it must have manifold categories. As Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many mansions." It must be pitched within and without, with pitch. The Schofield Reference Bible states that pitch is a symbol of atonement, that is, oneness with God. The ark, Noah's inspired thinking, our inspired thinking, must always lead to at-one-ment with God. It must have length, breadth, and height, or a sense of line, plane, and space. The days of creation have an ordered line of spiritual development. They are ever on a plane of inspired and scientific thought, and they operate throughout all space. The ark was also to be built with lower, second, and third stories. Spiritual idealism must be applicable on every level of thought. The relative, that is, the application to the human, the absolute, and the divine. As we understand the days of creation and their operation, and as we allow them to lead us into an at-one-ment with the divine principle, God, we too have an ark to comfort and protect us. Who would not desire his ideal to be born of perfection? The 777 of Lamech. Who would not, moreover, desire his ideal to be based on a divine sense of multiplication and eternity? The 500 of Noah. Who would not desire to be able intelligently to analyze, expose, and destroy evil through a process of scientific spiritual thought? Noah's 3 sons. Who would not desire an ark or spiritual ideal with manifold categories, operating through a definite line of thought, on a plane of true idealism and capable of being demonstrated anywhere throughout all space? What an ark for humanity to possess in these days of an overwhelming flood of fear, hate, greed, distrust, lust for power, and so on. Oh, for the time when men put aside past superstitions about God and reality, when they cease to draw their conclusions from materiality and its vagaries, and accept the Bible as a truly scientific textbook from which they can learn to think and act from the basis of the one infinite cause or divine mind, God. Then every individual will be enabled to know God aright and to prove his understanding on a spiritual and scientific basis. This individual and collective understanding of God is destined to be the church of the future, and in that church there will be neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, neither Catholic nor Protestant, Hindu nor Muslim, but only earnest thinkers. This ultimate of human hope and desire can only be realized through the scientific and spiritual understanding of the divine principle of the universe. The sincere and unbiased thinker can start working toward this goal now, for he can understand divine metaphysics. He can have an individual ark, that is, a process of salvation with system, order, and rule, and so have dominion over the floods of materiality. Thus he will be understanding and using the system of divine metaphysics from the focal point of the second day of creation and its infinite numeral of inspired thought. See Appendix 1, Second Day. Noah enters the ark. We all know the familiar words, "The animals went in 2 by 2. In such a way was Noah commanded to take the animals into the ark, by 2s. But later he was told to take 7 of every kind of clean beast and 2 of unclean. It seems that he was to take into his thought first the moral as applied to the male and the female, a relative sense, the 2, and also the absolute and perfect sense of truth, which recognizes neither male nor female, the 7. In studying the Hexateuch, we must bear in mind that many of its editors were also the authors of the priestly document. These were the men who had written the story of the days of creation, and so the symbolism which they had outlined constantly reappears. We must also remember that although the priestly writers edited, insofar as they could, the previous documents and brought them into line with their own progressive sense of spiritual idealism, they had to retain the original text to a great extent, as every detail of these writings was known to the Hebrews and held sacred by them. Consequently, there are different versions of the various incidents. For instance, the Yahweh document states that the flood lasted for 40 days, whilst the priestly document states that it lasted for 150 days, or 5 months. In each case, the writer was using a symbol to illustrate his own particular religious sense of things, and when metaphysically understood, they present the same picture. Regarded merely as numbers, they contradict each other and render the record invalid as a historical account. So it is whenever one tries to read the Scriptures as a factual record. It is recorded that Noah was 600 years old when he entered the ark. Can any intelligent thinker really believe that Noah was exactly 500 years old when he begat Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and exactly 600 when he entered the ark? Of course, this is another symbolic illustration of a thought process which can take place with each one of us today. As we begin to rise in thought, the fifth day, and are able to analyze, uncover, and annihilate the physical sense of the universe, we become aware of the dominion given to man in God's image and likeness, the sixth day, symbolized here by the statement that Noah was 600 years old. And thus we enter into a sense of safety and security from the storms of material existence. In other words, we enter the ark. If we regard these stories as matters of human history, we have to resort to the dishonest shifts to support their accuracy. But they're intended to be symbols, and if we consider them as such in this scientific age of ours, we shall reap the benefits that will accrue to us through an unbiased consideration of the most wonderful book in the world, on the intelligent understanding of which humanity's safety and sanity depends. The lessons of the ark. In this Noah story, there are a great many lessons which are essential for humanity to learn. For instance, when Noah entered the ark, he was commanded to take in his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives, in that order. When he left the ark, he was commanded to come out with his wife, and his sons' wives, in a different order. It was to go forth from the ark with his wife, the ideal to which he was wedded, foremost in his thinking. That Noah did not obey this spiritual demand, but came out as he went in with his sons first, that is, with the effects of his ideal first, may explain much of his later experience. Every wise spiritual thinker, when he understands something of reality and goes forth into the world to prove this understanding, places his ideal foremost, rather than the fruits of that ideal. What made the prophets of Israel great was that their ideal was always in the forefront of their thoughts. Israel's understanding and acceptance of that ideal was always a secondary consideration. To take another instance of a valuable lesson, we read in Genesis chapter 7, verse 17, "And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased, and bare up the ark, and it was lift above the earth." The symbol 40 was a well-known biblical one. It was said that the children of Israel were in the wilderness for 40 years, and that Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 was used either to illustrate the operation of a four-dimensional calculus of inspired thought, as applied to human experience, or to illustrate the unbridled operation of the so-called calculus of mortal thought. In this case, of course, 40 refers to the so-called calculus of mortal thought. But in verse 17 there is recorded a great spiritual fact, which is comforting to each one of us. The fact is that if we have an ark of spiritual understanding, then when the floods of mortal thought seek to overwhelm us, our ark will be lifted up above the flood. This is a favourite theme of the Scriptures. For example, we read in Isaiah, "When the enemy shall come in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord shall lift up a standard against him." No one considers that such a statement refers to a physical happening, but recognizes it as an expression of spiritual fact through religious sentiment. Indeed, to reduce it to a human and historical level would be to rob it of its real value. Such statements were written for those who have eyes to see, for those whose spiritual sense of reality can pierce the veil of materiality and grasp the pure spiritual fact which lies behind the symbol. We find no difficulty in appreciating the spiritual significance of the mustard seed, the fig tree, the secret place of the Most High, and so forth. And once we grasp the fundamental root notions of spirituality, we shall be able to translate other portions of the Bible in the most accurate and scientific, yet spiritual way. We are told in chapter 7 that all flesh was destroyed, but that Noah only and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. The fleshly or material sense of all things must eventually yield to the spiritual and disappear, and this divine process will take its course in each one of us as we make for ourselves an ark of spiritual and scientific understanding. It is related in chapter 8 that God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. Wind is frequently used in the Bible as a symbol of the omnipotence of God. Ezekiel, who is thought to have had much to do with the writing of the priestly document, uses the symbol of 4 winds, indicating the power of the divine calculus in this way. Come from the 4 winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. And the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood upon their feet, an exceeding great army. In the Noah story, it is evident that the writer is using the symbol wind to illustrate the great spiritual fact that an understanding of reality will not only comfort and save us, and those dear to us, but eventually its power will also be made manifest universally. We shall ultimately help in overcoming the floods for our fellow men. The ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. Genesis 8:4. Holy ground. Why does this record say that it rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day? Were not the priestly writers using the familiar tone of the 7th day of creation, on which God rested? Were they not signifying that Noah realized that this experience of the flood had ceased, and that he was conscious in some measure of the perfection of divine reality? The raven and the dove. Before the flood subsided, Noah did 2 very interesting things. First, he sent out a raven to see if the waters had abated. This sending out of the raven, which did not return, is a good illustration of the futility of attempting to deal with the flood of false mortal concepts on a basis of superstition or ignorance. The raven was an object of superstition. The raven went forth to and fro, and the reader will remember in the story of Job that Satan, when asked by God, "Whence comest thou?" replied, "From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it." Next, Noah sent out a dove, and this he had to do 3 times. Here's another illustration of the very definite way to deal with the flood of mortal theories. The dove was always considered to be a symbol of purity. The first time the dove is sent out corresponds to the process of analyzing the physical as merely mortal belief. The dove returns, for there is nothing of spiritual value to show at this stage. Then, if we are wise like Noah, we wait 7 days. That is, we renew and culture our spiritual sense of the divine system. The dove is then sent out again, and this time it brings back an olive branch. The moral, a promise of salvation. After this, like Noah, we again wait 7 days. We culture still further our understanding of the system of divine metaphysics. The dove is then sent out a 3rd time, and finds that the waters have abated, that the material sense of things has disappeared, and that spiritual sense reigns supreme. Every one of us at some time has to learn the lesson that it is of no avail to try to work out our problems through the raven, for we can only do it through the dove. What a wealth of both spiritual vision and truly scientific reasoning these symbols yield for us, when we understand and utilize the perfect spiritual idealism of the Bible. Noah leaves the ark. The climax of this portion of the story is recorded as follows. And Noah removed the covering of the ark, looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. Genesis 8:13. Later, Isaiah expressed the same spiritual sentiment, a sense of complete victory over the material, in these words, "And he will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is spread over all nations." And no one is likely to forget this symbol of Jesus' victory over the flesh. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. Finally, it is recorded that Noah, in leaving the ark, made the mistake of placing foremost the results of his ideal, instead of his ideal itself. Jesus emphasized the unwisdom of such action when he told his followers, "Rejoice not that the spirits are subject unto you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven." The spiritual ideal should always be supreme in our affections, and the result of that ideal in human experience should always be a secondary consideration. So many religionists have made the mistake of glorifying the visible effects of the divine and infinite cause, instead of striving to understand more of the cause itself. It is interesting to note that when Noah left the ark with his 3 sons, it is said, "Of them was the whole earth overspread." Genesis 9:19. It will be through these 3 sons of Noah, spiritual understanding operating through true analysis, exposure and annihilation, that the whole of mortal belief will eventually be eradicated individually and by mankind as a whole. God's Covenant with Noah. In chapter 9, beginning at verse 8, there is the record of God's covenant with Noah. A covenant is an agreement, and whenever we understand and can prove the divine presence and power, we agree or find oneness with the infinite, and thus we make a new covenant. As this covenant is of the nature of science, it is always universal, and applies to all creation. And what was the promise to Noah which would seal this new covenant? The promise was that whenever the clouds of dark, ignorant, mortal belief presaged a flood in human experience, there would always be a bow in the cloud. The rainbow, with its 7 colours, is a symbol of the 7 colours or tones of the days of creation, which Noah had already understood and used to some extent, and which we can use today. The science of God and man and the universe is the prism that splits the white light of truth into 7-fold numerals of inspired thought and idea, and this gives to mankind the promise of an eternal bow in the cloud. Noah's limited perception. So Noah, having glimpsed and used some measure of the divine system, was enabled to prove the divine power in the overcoming of a flood of human theories in his experience. Had he been willing to progress still further, he would not have returned to being an husbandman, a tiller of the soil or mortal belief, making the fatal mistake which religionists so often make of trying to work out his salvation through a struggle with evil as something real, rather than through the grace of God, that is, through science. It must be remembered that this symbol of Noah and the ark depicts the divine system from the focal point of the second day only, and the record therefore illustrates that the salvation that came to Noah was only partial. The story of Noah is an illustration in particular of that second stage of the revelation of God's nature, symbolized by, "And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day." One must ever be willing to press forward constantly in the understanding of this divine system of metaphysics. The climax of the story of Noah illustrates how fatal it is to be satisfied with a partial view of reality, and to rest on that alone. Noah finally became immortal with concepts, and was uncovered within his tent. His younger son, Ham, representing the physical, saw his father thus, for the physical can see no further than the nakedness of its own beliefs, and so, perceiving only the physical, Ham, like Cain, brought penalty upon himself. But Shem and Japheth, representing the moral and the spiritual, were blessed, for they covered their father's nakedness. they sought to fulfill the Christ ideal by making nothing of materiality. As Paul says, "Not for that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life." It is said that Noah only lived 350 years after the flood. This symbol of 3.5 is used throughout the Bible in the form of a time, times, and half a time, or 1,260 days, or 3.5 years, or the middle of the week, and it is recognized as indicating the halfway station of salvation and inspiration. The symbol of Noah, therefore, portrays only a certain aspect of the divine system of metaphysics, as revealed in the Scriptures. The story of Babel. The story of the Tower of Babel forms the climax of the second 1,000 years of Bible history. It is based on an ancient myth, and is the last of what are known as the origin stories in the Bible. It tells of the attempt to build a city, a calculus of thought, founded on a merely human basis, which always brings confusion. Babel means confusion, and also to build a tower, thought that is essaying to rise, but again is founded on the same material basis. The effort is in vain, as every effort must be, that does not build on the purity of spiritual things, on the divine fact of one infinite substance, Spirit. The second 1,000-year period, a symbol of divine order. The author has tried in this analysis of the second 1,000 years of Bible history to be as concise as possible. But the story is such a living symbol of the divine order and its infinite availability to men, and also of the hopelessness of trying to think and live without a sense of divine order, that it has been difficult to condense. He can only hope at this point that the reader has begun to appreciate not only the fact that an exact system of metaphysics is contained in the record of the Bible, but also the stupendous value to humanity of such a system, and the imperative need today of the ability to apply it to our human problems. Now that some of our foremost thinkers are telling us that the real universe is composed of ideas, it is surely of the greatest importance that we should be able to understand and use these ideas intelligently. Moreover, it should not be forgotten that the writers of the scriptural records, and especially the later editors, were the inspired prophets of Israel, whose spiritual vision has rarely been excelled. Jesus, the master metaphysician, immediately after his resurrection, impressed upon his followers the necessity of understanding their writings. We read in Luke, "And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself." It is certain that in doing any job the important thing for us is to understand how to use our tools. In this instance, our tools are the days of creation or revelation and their numerals of thought, operating in an infinite calculus of the Word, seeking, the Christ, finding, Christianity, using, and science, being. The more distinctly we understand these fundamentals, as depicted in the scriptural symbols, and the more we feel their natural warmth and living values, the more dynamic our divine tools will become to us. The importance and necessity of the reiteration of the fundamentals throughout this book will therefore be recognized. The Noah symbol, when understood, is to a Christian what his first glimpse of the use of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division is to a small boy. He learns the all-important lesson of how to use his numerals of thought intelligently in computation, and how to apply them to what seems to him a flood of mistakes. The first 1,000 years of the Bible gave us a sense of the days of creation as analyzing, uncovering, and destroying the Adam myth, the false concept of God and man. The second 1,000-year period reveals to us the eternal divine order in which the days of creation must ever operate and combine. So we're beginning to find both spiritual idealism and spiritual science in the record of the Bible, with myriad illustrations of their use.